Imagine a village in the mountains of northern India. The year is 1887. A boy is kneeling in the snow outside his home, pressing his forehead to the frozen ground, begging a God he does not yet believe in to either show himself or end the boy's life by morning. He is 14 years old. His mother has just died, and something inside him has gone quiet in a way that no one around him knows how to name. His name is Mohan Lal, and he was not a special boy. He was a broken one. 3 days before that night in the snow, Mohan had done something that shocked everyone who knew him. He had taken his mother's Bible, the Bible she had received from a missionary school, the Bible she had read aloud to him as a child, the one he hated because he believed it was the source of everything wrong about the British and their presence in India, and he had torn it apart page by page and thrown it into the fire. He watched the pages curl and blacken, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no release, only the same hollow weight that had been pressing on his chest since the fever took her. His mother had died a Christian in a Hindu home. She had spent years praying quietly, in secret, in the corner of the kitchen before anyone else woke. Mohan had always known. He had never told his father, and now she was gone, and the God she prayed to had not done a thing to stop it. So he knelt in the snow and issued an ultimatum. "Show yourself, or I will walk to the train tracks before dawn." He meant it. What happened next, Mohan would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately, and failing. He said a light filled the courtyard. Not the light of a lamp, not reflected moonlight off the snow. A light that had weight, that had warmth, that moved with what he could only call intention. And in the center of it, a presence that he recognized instantly, the way you recognize a voice you have known since before you could speak. He did not hear words. He felt a question, not asked at him, but asked through him, the way a bell does not think about the sound it makes. And Mohan, still kneeling, understood for the first time that the hollow place inside him was not an absence of his mother. It was the exact shape of what he had been refusing his entire life. He did not go to the train tracks. He went inside and waited for dawn, and then he told his father what had happened. And everything that had been stable in his world came apart. His father was a man of standing. He was a landowner, a respected elder in the community, a man whose family name carried generations of devotion to the ancient traditions of their people. He had tolerated his wife's quiet faith because she had been quiet about it. He had not married a convert. He had married a woman who became one, and he had chosen, for the sake of peace, to look away. He could not look away from this. The conversation lasted 3 days. By the end of it, his father had given him a choice: recant what you saw or leave this house and never return. He was 15 years old. He had no money, no plan, no community that would receive him. The nearest Christian mission was 2 days' walk away, and he had spent years mocking the people who attended it. He left. Have you ever been in a place like that? Where the thing you now know to be true has cost you every structure that made your life feel possible? Where the price of staying honest is the loss of everyone who knew you before? That moment in the road, when Mohan turned his back on his father's gate, was not a moment of triumph. It was the loneliest morning of his young life. He walked and he wept and he kept walking, because he had nowhere else to go. And because the presence he had met in the snow had not felt like a feeling, it had felt like a fact. And you cannot unknow a fact simply because knowing it is inconvenient. He arrived at the mission in Ludhiana 2 days later, half frozen and entirely unknown. The missionary who received him, a quiet Scotsman named Reverend James Macaulay, asked him only one question that first evening. Not what denomination he intended to join, not whether his theology was correct, not whether he had been baptized. He asked, "What did you see?" And Mohan told him. And Macaulay, who had spent 20 years in northern India watching people arrive at that mission for all manner of reasons, curiosity, hunger, social convenience, colonial pressure, said something to him that the boy never forgot. He said, "That is not a story I can teach you. That is a story that was told to you directly. My job is only to help you understand the language it was spoken in." Mohan was baptized 4 months later. He took the name Samuel. But among the people who would come to know him over the next decades, he was almost never called that. He was called, in the villages and in the hills, and eventually across the mountains into Tibet, simply Brother Mohan. The man who came barefoot, the man who would not carry money, the man who, When asked why he chose the yellow robe of the sadhu rather than the black coat of the missionary, said, "The water of life is the same, but I must carry it in a vessel that my people can receive." He was 22 years old when he first crossed into Tibet. This requires some understanding of what that meant in 1895. Tibet was not merely a foreign country. It was a closed world, ancient and deliberate in its closure. The lamas who governed the region's spiritual life were not tolerant of outside teaching. There were passes you could cross, theoretically. There were also stories, credible, documented, witnessed stories, of what happened to those who entered unauthorized. People disappeared into those mountains. Men who carried the wrong book in the wrong village did not always come back out. Mohan crossed anyway. Not because he was reckless, because there were people on the other side of those mountains who had never heard what he had heard. And the compulsion he felt about that fact was not something he could reason himself out of. Comment below with "I will go if he sends me" if you have ever felt that pull, the sense that God is asking you toward something that has no guaranteed path home. And stay with us through the end of this story, because what happened to Mohan in Tibet will answer a question you may have been carrying for years without knowing it had an answer. The first crossing was in winter. He nearly died on the pass. His feet froze badly enough that when he reached the first settlement, a small cluster of stone buildings where a family let him thaw by their fire, he could not walk for 4 days. He used those 4 days to begin learning what he could of the local dialect. When he could walk again, he kept going. What followed over the next several years was not a triumphant missionary saga. It was quieter and harder and stranger than that. Mohan did not plant churches in the Western sense. He sat with people. He learned their language, their customs, the structure of their prayers. He asked more questions than he answered. He slept in the same conditions his hosts slept in. He ate what they ate. He did not hand out Bibles. He did not hold public meetings. He simply lived among people and let what he carried speak without a platform. And something happened that none of the mission administrators who later heard about it knew quite what to do with. People in those villages began to have encounters that sounded, when they described them, like the one Mohan had described in the snow at age 14. Not because he was manipulating them, not because he was performing anything, but because the presence he had been carrying since that night in his father's courtyard appeared to not be localized to him. It went with him into rooms. It preceded him sometimes. There were accounts, specific, named accounts from specific villages, corroborated by multiple witnesses, of people experiencing light and warmth and an overwhelming sense of being known before Mohan opened his mouth, before he prayed, before he said a word. He spent roughly 3 months in Tibet on that first journey. He was discovered eventually by the local religious authorities. He was brought before the chief lama of the region, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable power, who questioned him at length about his presence, his purposes, and his God. Mohan answered every question. He did not argue. He did not perform. He simply described what he had seen in the snow, what he had carried since, and what he had watched happen in the villages on his way through the mountains. He was respectful. He was specific. He was utterly unafraid. The chief lama studied him for a long moment, and then he said, in the measured tone of a man who has spent a lifetime distinguishing between truth and its imitations, "You are not a fanatic. You are a witness." He ordered Mohan expelled from the region but not harmed. There were others who pressed for something harsher. The lama did not permit it. He simply had him escorted to the border and returned to India. Mohan crossed again the following year, and the year after that. Now, stop. Before we talk about what he saw in those mountains, we need to talk about what he was doing in the valleys below them during the months between crossings. Because the pattern of his life in those years is the thing that modern accounts of his story almost universally skip past. And it is the thing that explains everything that followed. Between each journey, Mohan would return to a small room in Sabathu, a hill station in the lower Himalayas, and disappear into solitude for weeks at a time. Not the kind of romantic solitude that gets turned into a spiritual aesthetic, the uncomfortable kind. Long hours of silence in which, by his own letters, nothing felt particularly holy. Hours in which he struggled with doubt, with grief, with the physical consequences of what repeated Himalayan winters were doing to his body. He had chronic pain in his feet from the frostbite. He developed a cough in his late 20s that never fully left him. He wrote about those months the way a man writes who does not expect the letters to be published. He wrote to a friend in England, "I am not always aware of the fire. There are weeks when I can only trust that it is still burning below what I can feel. I have learned that the absence of sensation is not the absence of God, but I confess that learning it again each time does not become easier." He did not maintain his ministry by traveling more. He maintained it by stopping. The mountain crossings were the fruit. The silent room in Sabathu was the root. By 1903, Mohan had made 5 crossings into Tibet. He had also traveled through Burma, Ceylon, and parts of China, and had spoken at universities and churches across England and Australia during a period when his story had begun to reach a wider audience. He was not a comfortable speaker by Western standards. He sat rather than stood. He did not use notes. He did not build toward an argument. He simply began with what he had seen and described his way forward from there, and people who had come expecting a religious performance sat instead in a silence they had not anticipated, and, in some cases, started weeping without knowing why. A professor at Cambridge who attended one of those talks wrote afterward to a colleague, "I went expecting an interesting cultural specimen. I left having encountered something I do not have an academic category for. The man does not persuade. He shows." Mohan spent time at a well-known Christian community in South India during this period, sitting under the teaching of older men of prayer, the kind of formation that roots a ministry too large for its vessel to carry alone. He was not famous enough yet to be treated as important, which was, by his own admission in letters of that period, a gift he did not fully appreciate until later, because what came later required everything that ground had built. In 1909, Mohan returned to Tibet for what would become his most significant and most dangerous journey. He traveled deeper into the interior than he ever had before. He reached a monastery complex in a region where foreigners had almost never been seen. He spent several days there, speaking with monks and students, having long theological conversations through a partially shared dialect that required enormous patience from everyone involved. And then he was arrested. The charges, to the extent they could be translated, amounted to disturbing the religious order of the region. The sentence was intended to be permanent. He was taken to a dry well on the edge of the monastery grounds. The well was approximately 15 feet deep, stone-walled, with a locked iron grate across the top. It was used historically for the disposal of animals that had died. The smell was what people always mentioned first when Mohan described it in later years. He said it was the smell of things that had been discarded and forgotten. They put him in the well. They locked the grate, and they left. He said afterward that the first hours were the worst, not because of the cold or the smell or the darkness, but because of the silence. The human mind in that kind of silence begins to produce its own noise, the catalogue of every regret, every decision that led here, every voice that ever told you this would end badly. He said he lay on the floor of the well and let the catalogue run. He did not fight it, he did not pray over it, he simply let it come, and then it stopped. The way a record reaches its end, and the needle lifts, and in the silence that followed, he said, the same presence he had met in the snow at 14 was simply there, not speaking, not performing, simply present. The way heat is present in a room before you think to describe it. On the 3rd night, something woke him. He had been sleeping somehow. A detail he found remarkable for the rest of his life, that a man could sleep in those conditions. He woke to the sound of the grate moving. He looked up. In the darkness, a silhouette was crouching over the opening, working at the lock. The grate swung open. A rope came down, and a voice, very quiet in the local dialect, "Come up now." Mohan climbed. He reached the top of the well. He stood in the cold mountain air and looked around, and no one was there. He walked. He found the path out of the monastery grounds. He found the road south. He did not stop walking until the lights of the nearest settlement were visible below him on the hillside. He never identified who opened the well. He refused, in all the years of speaking about it afterward, to draw a firm conclusion about the nature of what had happened. He would only say, with a quietness that somehow carried more weight than certainty would have, "I was in the well, and then I was not, and I did not open the grate myself." Will you hold your conviction when it costs you the physical safety that every sane person considers non-negotiable? When the structure above your head is locked, and you have done nothing wrong, and the people who put you there believe absolutely that they are serving a higher order, where do you find what Mohan found in that well? The capacity to stop fighting the silence and let it become something other than emptiness. The years between 1910 and 1920 were the period in which Mohan's influence spread fastest and was understood least. He continued traveling. He continued the crossings. He spoke in Japan and in parts of the United States, where audiences who had come expecting a dramatic preacher encountered instead a man in a saffron robe who sat very still and said things so quietly that people in the back rows leaned forward without realizing it. During a tour of America in 1920, a woman in the audience at a meeting in Philadelphia, a woman who had been unable to walk without assistance for 7 years following a nerve injury, stood up during a moment of extended silence and walked the length of the aisle to the front of the room. She did not do this in response to anything Mohan said. He had been sitting in silence for approximately 3 minutes. She simply stood and walked, and then she sat down again in the front row and put her face in her hands and cried without making a sound. Mohan did not mention it. He continued sitting. The meeting went on. The woman's physician documented the case. The documentation is still archived at a hospital in Pennsylvania. There were other cases. A man in Madras whose tuberculosis reversed after an evening of extended prayer in Mohan's presence. A child in a village outside Simla who had not spoken since a fever at age 3, and who spoke first in syllables and then in a sentence during a meeting at which Mohan was not even the central speaker. He was simply present in the room. He never claimed these healings as his own work. When pressed, he said the same thing he always said: "I am a lantern. I do not produce the light. I only try not to block it." By 1925, Mohan was widely known in Christian circles across Europe, North America, and South Asia. His name was spoken in the same conversations as the great mystics of earlier centuries. Publishers in London and New York had released collections of his writing. He had been invited to lecture at Oxford. A biography was in preparation, and his cough had become something the doctors used more specific language for. He knew, he had known for some time. The lungs that had carried prayer up and over 6 Himalayan passes in 30 years of winter crossings were not going to carry him much longer. He was told to stop traveling. He was told, specifically and directly by physicians who used unambiguous language, that another crossing into the mountain altitude would accelerate a process that was already in motion. He crossed one more time. In the spring of 1929, he was 56 years old. Those who were with him in the weeks before departure described him as the most at peace they had ever seen him. Not resigned, at peace. There is a difference, and the people who loved him saw it clearly. He was not performing acceptance. He was not being brave for an audience. He simply appeared to have settled something with himself, or with someone, that no longer needed revisiting. He left for the mountains in April. He was seen crossing the pass by a group of traders who knew him by sight and exchanged brief greetings with him. He was, they said, walking steadily. He had his staff. He was wearing his robe against the cold, and he did not stop. He did not come back. No body was ever found. No village on the other side of the pass recorded a final illness or a death. The pass itself was searched the following autumn, when the summer melt made it accessible. Nothing. The mountain simply held him. In the years following his disappearance, some speculated, some grieved, some wrote long theological treatments about what his death, or translation, or disappearance meant. Mohan would have found all of it slightly beside the point. He had said what he thought about it, obliquely, in a letter written only weeks before he departed, to a friend who had asked him how he felt about growing old. "I have been a guest in this world, and in this body," he wrote. "I am not troubled by the approach of the moment when the visit ends. I am only grateful that the host allowed me to carry what I carried for as long as I did." 300,000 people across India attended memorial services in the months following the news of his disappearance. In Tibet, in at least 2 of the villages where he had stayed during his crossings, families had begun keeping a small lamp burning, a practice that no outside teacher had asked them to begin, and that no one seems to have coordinated. They simply did it, because something about the man had made them want to keep the gesture going. He carried it in a vessel that his people could receive. The fire did not care about borders. It did not care about altitude. It did not care about the opinions of anyone who believed it could be contained by a locked iron grate at the top of a stone well. Today, scholars who study the history of Christian mysticism in the South Asian tradition return to Mohan's letters and his recorded talks not for the dramatic miracles, though the documented accounts of those are real and available, but for something quieter, for the clarity with which he described the interior life, for the way he talked about the weeks in Sabathu when nothing felt holy, for the honesty with which he distinguished between experience and presence, between the feeling of God and the fact of God. He was not the first person to make that distinction, but he made it in a voice that sounded like someone who had tested it against real conditions, not theoretical ones, against frostbite and a stone well and a locked grate and a father who told him to choose, and tuberculosis, and an entire mountain range that eventually said, "That is enough," and kept him. The question pressing toward you now is not whether Mohan's life was remarkable. The question is what you are doing with the same hollow place he felt at 14, kneeling in the snow. You have felt it. The thing that successful religious activity cannot fill, the longing underneath the schedule. The knowing that what you are carrying is not the full weight of what you were made for. Mohan joined a tradition he had burned. He crossed mountains he had no business crossing. He stood before a man who had the power to end his life and described a light he had seen in a courtyard at 14 years old. He sat in a stone well for 3 nights without losing whatever it was he had found in the snow. And people on 5 continents are different today because he did. What price are you willing to pay? Find a moment today, not a scheduled quiet time, not a religious routine, and simply stop. The way Mohan stopped in Sabathu, not to perform stillness, not to produce an experience, just to see what is already present in the room when you finally stop filling it with motion. He never saw the full harvest. The lamp still burns in 2 Tibetan villages, kept by families who never read his biography, who never heard his name spoken at a conference, who only know that something was different when he was in the room. That is not a theological argument. That is a testimony, and it is still being given. Comment below with "I will go if he sends me," if you are done waiting for a safer path and ready to carry what was placed in you for the people only you can reach.